It's week one. Whether you drafted a strong roster or not, the start of games is bound to make you overthink every decision. Should I sit that early running back because of his matchup? Do I start that QB in spite of his matchup because I drafted him? And what about that guy who's still limited in practice? Well, we're here to dig into all that and help you set your first lineups of the season. Week one of the Draft Sharks Preview podcast starts right now.
It's the Draft Sharks.
Matt Schaff and Jared Small of DraftSharks.com here to preview week one of the NFL calendar. No time to trim my face, Jared. We are in it. We've got the week one projections. Actually, have been in the system for quite a while at this point. They are powering the week one rankings, as well as all of your team intel pages, helping you set your lineups. But the start of the season also starts overthinking season for all of us, Jared, as we set those lineups. I would say we're here to try to cut down the overthinking in general, but I would say for week one specifically, because we don't have any actual game data to go on from this season yet, first of all, trust your draft over reaching for matchup plays in week one, because some of the matchups that we don't like are going to turn out to not be all that bad, and others that look like they're good will end up being negative. So keep in mind that we're really guessing about that stuff right now more than we will be in a few weeks. And that said, don't adhere to your draft too strictly. Just because you drafted like one wide receiver in round four and the other in round six doesn't mean that you have to start the round four guy over the round six guy, depending on their specific situations. We'll get more into that. But what do you think about those points and anything else about setting week one lineups?
Yeah, for me in week one, I want to lean on volume, right? I mean, I think you could almost go to our projections, sort by, projected carries and targets for running backs and start the highest guys there, sort by projected targets for wide receivers, start the highest guys there. Cause like you said, man, we don't have as much info about these matchups as we're going to have as we get deeper into the season now. I do think leaning on the order you drafted these guys is a good starting point. There are definitely some exceptions. I know, like Travis Hunter is someone that comes to mind, and we're going to talk about him. But we just don't know what his role is going to be. We're hoping he's going to play a lot of offense, but we don't know. So, in cases like that, don't be afraid to start someone you might have drafted lower. But again, I think safety and volume is what you want to be leaning on in your week one lineups.
We're going to go position by position on the show throughout the season, highlighting pertinent injuries, digging into players who present actual lineup decisions for the week. And let's start that at quarterback, of course. Jared, there's no injuries that we need to worry about in terms of who to start at this position this week. So let's jump right to guys that might be starters over the long term, but that look more benchable this week. For me, that starts with Justin Fields against the Steelers. He's projected for the fewest passing yards in the league this week, even fewer than Spencer Rattler. And that's not shocking for Justin Fields. Maybe versus Spencer Rattler is a little shocking. We, of course, know that what we like about Justin Fields is not the passing, but the rushing. Now he's facing Pittsburgh this week, and we just finished saying don't look too much into the matchups. I feel like we've got enough background on these Steelers to say it's probably going to be one of his worst matchups of the season. And not only should we expect the Pittsburgh defense to at least be pretty good, it's also a team that he played for last year. Justin Fields, all these coaches, all those defensive players in Pittsburgh know him, practiced against him, worked with him in the meeting room. So it's got to be the team that's best prepared to defend against Justin Fields, I would think.
Yeah, this game's just going to stink. It has a 38.5 over under, easily the lowest of the week. I just, if you're breaking ties, just break them against this game, I think. On top of the matchup stuff for Fields, he had a rough training camp by most accounts. It's his first game with the Jets, a new coaching staff, new offensive coordinator, Tanner Engstrom, his first game as an NFL offensive coordinator. The Jets have the second lowest implied total on the week at 17.75 points. They're probably going to be near the bottom of the league most weeks, honestly, I think, but this is about as low as it's going to get, I think, 17.75. They also just lost guard Elijah Vera Tucker probably for the season with a torn tricep, which doesn't help matters either. He's one of the better interior O-linemen in the NFL. He was 12th last year among guards in both PFF pass blocking and run blocking grade. So just a lot working against Fields here. If you bench him and he ends up running for 80 yards and a score, just be happy he's on your team. But I think in a lot of cases, even if you drafted Fields as your quarterback one, he's better off on your bench this week.
Yeah, I think to me this week his upside is a fine game as opposed to a huge game. So I mean, don't reach and start Aaron Rodgers over him, but I would feel okay starting other options that are close in the rankings over Justin Fields. We do still have him at QB 13. I might even knock him another spot or two beyond that. Jordan Love, Justin Herbert stand out to me as guys that are not far behind him that I think are probably at least a little bit more attractive this week. Maybe a little bit less so for Jordan Love if they don't have Jaden Reed, if Dontavian Wicks proves to be an injury issue heading into that game. Justin Herbert, I would probably feel a little bit more comfortable about in that matchup, just as, a couple of options to think about starting over Fields.
I actually have the Love Fields decision in my main event, and I have not made a final call on that yet. I think it's close for sure. Another quarterback that I know we were relatively high on and might be on a lot of Draft Sharks teams, Dak Prescott opens in a really tough spot tonight, Thursday night, in Philadelphia against the Eagles, who last year they were third in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They were actually even better than that over the final 2/3, second half of the season when their rookies Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean really got going. The Eagles actually allowed multiple passing touchdowns in just 3 of their final 13 games last year. And Dallas's implied total, 19.5 points, the 4th lowest on the week. So that just tells you how much respect the books are giving this Eagles defense. It's a really tough spot for Dak Prescott, another guy who you might have drafted him as your quarterback one, but hopefully you have another option for it this week.
So speaking of other options, if we're telling people to sit Justin Fields or Dak Prescott, who might be some, I don't know, sneakier level quarterback starts that they could put in their lineup instead?
Yeah, you won't be surprised to hear this one from me, but I think Trevor Lawrence is the first one you can look to. And he's actually available in 55% of sleeper leagues as of Thursday morning. So even if you didn't draft him, you might be able to go grab him right now off the waiver wire. I would start him over Justin Fields. I would start him over Dak Prescott this week. And it's not just me saying that. The Vegas lines have the Jags implied for 25.25 points this week, the 6th highest implied total on the week. I'm sure some of that is just, the potential of this offense with the weapons they have with Liam Cohen. The other half of that is this matchup against Carolina. The Panthers last year, 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. I don't think they're going to be that much better this year. Jags are at home. Just a great spot for Lawrence and this Liam Cohen offense to, kind of get going right out of the gate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would start Trevor Lawrence over both those guys. And you can use the free agent finder to see if Trevor Lawrence is available in any of your leagues. Drake May against the Raiders, another guy who we love the rushing. He brings not Justin Fields level rushing, but not that far behind. So we like that setting the fantasy floor. And the matchup with the Raiders, I mean, just like you said with the Panthers, the Raiders were not very good on defense last year. I don't see why we should expect them to be a whole lot better this year. They do get a healthier Max Crosby after losing him at the end of last season, but still, even with a healthy Crosby, that has not been a good defense over the past few years.
Yep, agreed. Good matchup for May. He's at home. You have, the Raiders, a West Coast team, traveling to the East Coast for a 1 o'clock start. I always, like that factor. And the Patriots have a 23-point implied total. Not huge, 13th highest in the league, but better than they were almost all of last year, more points than they scored last year. So, some optimism for this offense as well.
It might not be huge in general, but it's freaking enormous versus what they were projected for all of last season.
Exactly.
If you're struggling to pick between a couple of quarterbacks, check the Draft Sharks Who to Start tool. It's free to use even if you're not a Draft Sharks member, but if you are an insider, then it will apply your specific league settings to help you make the optimal decision for your roster, not only a quarterback, but any position that you need. Switching over to running back now, Jared, let's start with injuries. There's not a lot here in terms of starter level players, but one biggie that we'll have to watch is Devon Achane with the calf injury, is back in practice, was limited Wednesday, seems to be trending toward playing in the game, but we'll have to watch just to make sure he's good to go as we set our lineups.
Yeah, would love to see him get in a full practice on either Thursday or Friday, but he's been back at practice for a few days now. Seems to be optimism that he'll be ready to go. So definitely have him penciled into fantasy lineups for now, but we'll keep an eye on Shark Bites for updates on that.
Najee Harris is practicing in full, so seems like he's going to be ready to play in week 1. We'll see how much he actually plays, but it also feels like Chargers coaches have been setting us up to not expect workhorse level work for Omarion Hampton in week 1. So where are you starting with the rookie?
Yeah, we'll see about Najee. Like at this point, he's going to play. I can't imagine he's ready for a big role after, unless he was doing more behind the scenes than we saw or heard about in training camp. Because what we saw and heard about was him just, lightly jogging, walking with a weighted vest on or whatever it was. Like, so I can't imagine him just being conditioned to play a big role in this game. We'll see though. I mean, it definitely adds some risk to Omarion Hampton. We were looking at his total yardage props, and he's at just 65.5 total yards on most sports books. A pretty, a lower number than we even have him projected for. So, he's a case where you probably took him in round 3 or round 4. It's probably tough to sit him, but Hampton is lower in our week 1 rankings than he was in our season long RB rankings.
Yeah, I think he's a good example of if you're struggling with the decision, if you're worried about these factors that we're talking about, and you're like, maybe I should just sit him in week 1 and play somebody else. It really depends heavily on the other options that you have. If it's somebody that's like down near 30, Austin Eckler territory, go ahead and start Hampton. Trust that you drafted him for good reasons, and trust that the Chargers are going to go ahead and play him because they like him as much as you did at draft time. And go ahead and take a shot. If it ends up being wrong, you got the rest of the season to rebound from that. But if it is a close call with Hampton versus somebody else that's right near him in our rankings, feel free to lean toward the option that feels a little safer. The Chiefs, by the way, did present the league's worst running back matchup last year by our adjusted fantasy points allowed, and they were ninth in run defense DVOA. So it wasn't, totally a fluke that they ranked so highly in denying running back points.
Yeah, Chargers in the bottom half of the league this week too in implied points. I think they're at 21 or 21 and a half implied points. So definitely respect being shown for that Chiefs defense, which was really good last year. And I think will again be, a top 10, maybe top 5 defense.
Injury also appears like it won't be a factor for Ken Walker deciding whether to start the Seattle running back that we obviously like quite a bit, had him as our breakout player for the season. Dealt with foot soreness in the summer, missed a notable amount of practice in August, but no position on the week 1 injury report for Ken Walker. So I say go ahead and fire away, and then we'll leave the workload questions for the evidence that we actually get in that game, and then, figure that out going forward.
Yeah, there was a lot of worrying in the fantasy community about Ken Walker, but the team never seemed worried. They just kind of kept calling it a maintenance thing. They wanted to, limit this guy's reps.
We have a plan.
We have a plan. Yep. And hopefully that plan is feeding Ken Walker early and often this season. Fine week 1 matchup. I think, the Niners last year, they were actually 25th in adjusted points allowed through running backs. I think they'll be a bit better than that this year, but I do think that, interior of that defensive line looks like the weakest part of the defense. So it could be a spot, especially with Sam Darnold making his first start for the Seahawks. It could be a spot where they, look to load Walker up with, 20 plus touches in this one.
Yeah. And beyond the foot soreness, the other recent concern is, oh no, they like Zach Charbonnet. Is he going to take a meaningful amount of work away from Ken Walker? We'll see. But there was a whole lot more Ken Walker buzz than there was Zach Charbonnet buzz this summer. So I'm going to go ahead and lean on that volume of buzz for Ken Walker. Trust him in week 1. And then if we have to adjust beyond that, we'll do so.
Who is Zach Charbonnet? That's a new name for me.
Yeah. I think he's a hockey player.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Breece Hall is the next guy on our list. And Jared, you mentioned the Jets losing guard Elijah Vera Tucker for the season, probably for the season, definitely at least the early part of the season. That's just another challenge for Breece Hall, who already had the challenge of us not knowing how much work he's going to get from a coaching staff that has spent more time talking up its group of running backs than it has its assumed number 1 running back.
I am very curious to just see what this backfield actually looks like now that the games are starting to matter for the Jets. Seems pretty clear that Braylon Allen is going to be involved. I think the question for me is Isaiah Davis, who in that first preseason game, he got all the third down work. Now he missed some time in August with an injury, but he's not on this week's injury report. So he looks ready to play. So, this could be a 3-man committee backfield. And that would be, tough for Breece Hall. Bad matchup. They lose Elijah Vera Tucker. Definitely not a must start. I don't care where you drafted Breece Hall. There are plenty of teams I think that probably have 2 better running back options this week, at least until we see what this backfield is going to look like.
Yeah, he's inside of starter territory for 12-team leagues and probably for most 10-team leagues as well. But in that range where you can pick somebody to go ahead of him, not a great matchup as we were talking about. Vikings against the Bears. Chicago's got the 31st run defense in DVOA by last year's numbers. We'll see what this year's group looks like. So what does that mean, especially with the Vikings being a slight favorite on the road, for how you deploy Aaron Jones and maybe Jordan Mason this week?
Yeah, the Bears were a big run funnel defense last year. They were first in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks and first in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, but just 24th against running backs. We also have JJ McCarthy making his first start, his first regular season action at all. So I would expect a run leaning game plan from the Vikings in this one. So I think Mason is in play as an RB3 flex. I think Aaron Jones is a strong play here because not only the matchup I think is good for him, but I think he's going to get a boost in passing game usage with Jordan Addison out for the Vikings. Addison missed 2 games last year. Aaron Jones saw 6 targets in both of those games. So even if we're looking at a 50-50 split on the ground between Jones and Mason, which I think is possible, I think Jones is going to see a good number of targets in this game. I think he's a nice RB2 play this week.
Yeah, I think that near certain receiving lead, we should expect him to be the clear backfield leader in receiving. That makes him a pretty easy bet over Jordan Mason. And then we'll see what the rushing split looks like this week. So I agree when you combine that with the matchup that was very good for running backs last year and no clear reason to change that expectation for this year, makes Aaron Jones a pretty easy play. I think he's probably a comfier play than Breece Hall. They're in very similar range of our rankings, though.
Yeah, I agree. I feel safer with Aaron Jones' workload this week.
Any sneaky starters for you at running back?
They got a few, and these are, again, down in RB3 flex territory. You're not going benching even, someone like Breece Hall for these guys. But I think both Browns running backs are in play this week. Jerome Ford and Dylan Sampson. They get the Bengals. This is a Bengals defense we're probably going to be attacking all year. Not only is the defense bad, but we know how good the offense is. That's going to create shootout potential in all these Bengals games. And I do think with Joe Flacco, like the Browns are capable of keeping pace and scoring points in this game. I definitely prefer Jerome Ford over Dylan Sampson. Ford, I think, is a very safe bet to get the passing down work. We'll see how the rushing work is split. But another reason to feel good about these Browns guys, too, is that the Browns dumped Pierre Strong at final cuts. He was their RB3 throughout the summer, with Quinshon Judkins still not signed as of now. Raheem Sanders is the Browns' number 3 running back right now. He's an undrafted free agent. He spent all of the offseason with the Chargers. So I think you're going to have this be a 2-man backfield, which makes, again, both Ford and Sampson a bit easier to rely on.
Yeah, I would play Ford over Dylan Sampson. I would hope to not have to use Dylan Sampson this week because Jerome Ford is obviously the more proven NFL producer. He's actually got some NFL seasons behind him versus Sampson being a rookie. Should especially lead the early receiving work, though, because Ford has been an effective receiver and, a high efficiency runner. So I like him if you do have to reach a little bit. Not saying to start him over anybody we have in the top 20, but I do like him if you need to reach for an option in a deeper league, especially. Austin Eckler could be even more of a reach. He's RB30 in our PPR rankings right now. So, I think that's the appropriate level. If you're reaching for that level of player, if you did like a 0 RB type of team build and you just don't know about your RB situation to open the season, Austin Eckler looks like a fairly high floor option versus what should be a decently soft Giants defense.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, with Eckler, we know he'll dominate the passing down work in this backfield. He's also going to mix in for at least some carries. And even just that role last year made him the RB32 in PPR points per game. And I think there's potential, especially early in the season, week 1, for him to play a bigger rushing role. If, Corey Krosky isn't quite ready to handle that Brian Robinson role, if Chris Rodriguez isn't as involved as we think he might be, there's potential for Eckler to get 10 carries in this game, in addition to, a handful of targets. So definitely a nice option in PPR if you're looking for, an RB3 flex type starter.
I would even say is a pretty good bet for 10 carries with potential to get 15 or so.
Yeah, it's definitely within the range of outcomes. Also, this Giants pass rush is going to be really strong. So it could be a spot where you see a lot of, quick hit passing game stuff, which, would definitely feature Austin Eckler.
Not to mention, by the way, we've got both Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel fairly low in the wide receiver rankings. So that presents opportunity for other guys this week.
Yeah, for sure. I think, we'll get to McLaurin here, but I think we're expecting him to be on at least some type of snap count after the holdout for much of August.
All right, switching over to wide receiver now. Also, no high level injuries. We talked about there being 1 at running back, none at quarterback. No real big guys that we have to worry too much about at wide receiver, but Darnell Mooney is worth monitoring. He's got his shoulder issue that kept him out for a lot of the summer, was still limited Wednesday. I would plan on not using him this week. Christian Kirk saw that he was about to maybe be relevant in week 1 and quickly injured a hamstring. He had no practice Wednesday. I would not plan on playing him in week 1. I do want to move to one other receiver, though, that has a minor injury issue, and we're kind of waiting to see just how minor or relevant that injury is. It's Tyreek Hill in Miami with the oblique issue. He, according to the South Florida Sun Sentinel, has been ramping up his practice workload, was still officially limited Wednesday when I don't believe they actually practiced officially. So I don't know what that really means. But we'll have to see over these last couple days of practice just how much of Tyreek Hill we're getting and what we hear out of Miami on what we should expect. And by the way, as a kind of an aside, but also relevant to this point, I think Mike McDaniel's getting more annoying in how he talks to the media and is probably going to spend all season giving us little to actually work with on this front.
Yeah, McDaniel's act is starting to wear a little thin on me. we've talked about him being on the hot seat. I'm not sure he's going to, make it to 2026. But I mean, with Hill, so what concerns me a little is we knew he had this oblique injury throughout August, but he's also on the injury report this week with a calf. I don't know if that's what had him limited on Wednesday. We haven't heard anything about it, but it's definitely on my radar. It just feels like it's going to be. And listen, I drafted a ton of Tyreek Hill, so I hope things go well. It just feels like it's going to be this kind of season where we're just always, wondering and worrying about Tyreek Hill for whatever reason. So I do think it's a good matchup. I like that Dolphins Colts game to potentially be high scoring. I think if Hill plays, you're obviously starting him. We'll have to keep an eye on the calf thing. I wanted to go back real quick with Christian Kirk. I would grab Jalen Noel if your league's waivers are still open. I'm assuming Jaden Higgins was drafted in most fantasy leagues and is not available. Jalen Noel could actually be the replacement for Christian Kirk because Kirk was going to play a lot in the slot. Noel's a slot receiver. We don't know anything about this hamstring injury, but a hamstring injury, no practice on Wednesday. I think there's a real chance Kirk does not play this weekend. And if that happens, like Noel, you're not going to start him. But if he goes out there and has a nice game as a third round rookie, like he could just stay involved throughout the rest of the season. So I think he's a good stash right now.
I agree with that. Going back to Tyreek Hill now, we have him still ranked in clear starter territory. He's going to check in significantly lower in my week one rankings. He's going to be more like a wide receiver 3, like the Tet McMillan to George Pickens range. We'll obviously track the injury situations, but even if he's all set to go by Sunday, we're talking about a guy who missed a lot of summer after a really disjointed season for him and the whole Miami passing game last year. So I'm not knocking him completely out of starter territory, but if I have 3 other pretty good to good options, I would rather play a little wait and see on Tyreek Hill in week one.
Prime opportunity for Jalen Waddle to get off to a big start this week. Excited about that.
Jerry Jeudy is wide receiver 20 in our week one PPR rankings. Why?
I didn't even like Jeudy that much in draft season, but I just think this is probably the best setup he'll have all year, right? Like he's the clear number 1 receiver at this point. We'll see if Cedric Tillman pushes him. Harold Fannin might come on at some point, but for now, I think Judy's the clear number 1 wide receiver. He has Joe Flacco under center, which I think, that's the quarterback that's going to be best for Judy's production this season. And he plays the Bengals. Cincinnati last year, 21st in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. We talked about this game has some shootout potential. So if you drafted Jeudy and aren't starting him this week, I'm not really sure why you drafted him.
Yeah, to be fair though, that's the second time in the show that you've talked about Joe Flacco being a positive. Are you drunk on a Thursday morning?
No, I watched Joe Flacco the last 2 years. The guy can still sling it.
Yeah, he's still a positive for the wide receiver production, especially versus what else they could have thrown out there. It'll be an interesting game to watch. And I certainly agree that if you drafted Jerry Jeudy and you're not starting him this week, then you have to wonder why he's on your team. Garrett Wilson, I think, is not the same case. He is the guy that I had in mind when I said earlier, just because you drafted a guy in round 4 and another wide receiver in round 6 doesn't necessarily mean you have to start the round 4 guy. Now, we talked about Justin Fields' matchup. We talked about his passing yardage projection. Obviously, that yardage volume is going to be a potential issue for not only Fields, but especially Garrett Wilson and any other pass catchers for the Jets all year. But like we said with Fields, they might be starting the year with their worst matchup of the season. We'll have to obviously wait a long time to see if that's the case, but it's quite possible that we look back on it and say, well, week 1 was easily the worst week of the season for the Jets offense. So Garrett Wilson still inside our top 24. I think it's okay to be apprehensive, even versus that position, and maybe consider starting a couple of guys that are ranked right behind him right now, if you would like to.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. Tough spot for the Jets offense in general. Even tougher spot for Garrett Wilson, who, the Steelers used Joey Porter to shadow on plenty of occasions last year. And if there's any team to use a shadow corner against this year, it's the Jets, who have Garrett Wilson and nothing else you have to worry about in the passing game. So I would expect Wilson to see Porter, who's, I think one of the 5 best corners in the NFL on most, if not all of his routes. Last year, the Steelers allowed the 10th fewest yards per game to opposing number 1 wide receivers, and they were 3rd in DVOA against number 1 wide receiver. So on top of just a bad spot for the Jets in general, it's an even tougher spot for Wilson, in his individual matchup.
Yeah, so check back over the weekend to see if Garrett Wilson moves down our rankings at all. But the thing working in his favor is, he could see 50% of the target volume in any single game throughout the year. So at some level, you have to be like, I'll just put him in my lineup this week and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, for sure.
DJ Moore is next up on our list. And Jared, I didn't bother trying to argue him up from wide receiver 27 in our PPR rankings, even though that's lower than where we had him in the full season rankings. Because I think it's fair to play some wait and see on the offense in this game. The new coaches, the quarterback who wasn't very good last year, and the new factors in the game to see exactly how the targets get split. That said, DJ Moore, in an offense where we have so many questions, he's the one guy that we know is a good answer. So for that reason, I like him in a spot where they're projected to lose that game by a point and a half, but they're, projected to lose. So should be motivated to pass some, could be an active game. I like DJ Moore better than a few of the guys that currently sit ahead of him in our wide receiver rankings. I'm looking at DK Metcalf, Ted McMillan, Garrett Wilson, Devontae Smith, maybe Jerry Jeudy. I'm not totally certain on that one. I guess I could go either way. And I'm starting DJ Moore over Tyreek Hill this week.
I can get on board with moving more up a little bit. I would start him over DK Metcalf. I would start him over Garrett Wilson this week. I do like him a bit better after digging into this matchup a bit more. I mean, the concern is, beyond the fact that we don't know exactly what this Bears offense is going to look like with all the new weapons and the new coaching staff, I do think it's just a tough spot for Chicago in general. First game under Ben Johnson. They get Brian Flores blitz happy defense on the Viking side. It's a tough matchup. Chicago's in play for 21 points, bottom half of the league this season. That said, for one, Ben Johnson had no issue with this Vikings defense in Detroit last year. In their two meetings, Jared Goff averaged 8.4 yards per attempt, 5 total touchdowns in those 2 games. So, we'll see if there's any carryover there. Also, the Vikings last year were dead last in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. And I think this is going to be a plus matchup for receivers again this season. So I'm a bit higher on DJ Moore now than I was, back on Monday, Tuesday. So we can move him up the rankings a couple spots. I do like getting him ahead of Garrett Wilson. I would definitely start Moore over Wilson this week.
Sweet. I didn't even have to argue DJ Moore up the rankings this week. This is how it should go every week, really. Like you said, though, that Vikings defense was good in general last year, but I think one spot where they weren't especially strong was cornerback. So that should continue to be a decent matchup for wide receivers. Terry McLaurin, we talked about a little bit earlier. Why is he at the bottom of wide receiver 3 territory this week?
Yeah, we're just projecting his snaps and routes to be a bit limited. And honestly, kind of using CD Lamb last year as the example. Lamb, after holding out last year, signed on August 26th. McLaurin signed on August 25th. And Lamb, if you look at last year's opener, played 71% of the snaps. He was up around 85 to 90% most games going forward. So his snaps were a bit limited. Of course, we talked about McLaurin all summer, how his production last year was a bit flimsy with all the touchdowns. I think his usage was more like a low-end wide receiver 2 last year. That's probably where he's going to be in our rankings most weeks. But I think you consider him more of a wide receiver 3 this week because of that holdout.
We'll talk in a minute about a couple of options that might be able to start ahead of Terry McLaurin if you have similar reservations. Travis Hunter got to be one of the most difficult projections, at least in recent memory, if not ever, just for the fact that we don't normally get a guy where we're not even sure which side of the ball he's better at. It does look like, from the way Jacksonville listed him on the depth charts, on official depth charts, it looks like they consider him a bit more of a receiver than a cornerback, at least for now. So we'll see how that goes. But how did you go about projecting Travis Hunter this week, Jared?
Yeah, definitely have him playing like the majority of the offensive snaps. I think we have him projected for like a 75% route rate, which is, good. It's not elite, but it's good enough. But it's just the uncertainty. If you look at Hunter's floor projection versus the wide receivers around him, it's much lower, and that's what's kind of dragging him down the rankings a little bit. Hunter also missed about 2 weeks in the second half of August with an upper body injury. Now, he's not on the week 1 injury report, so it's not a concern, but Liam Cohen did make a comment earlier this week about how that injury might impact how much he's able to do in this opener, just because he missed all that practice time. So that adds a bit more risk as well. I'm hoping our ranking on Hunter's wrong, that he comes out and he plays, a ton of offensive snaps, has a nice game. But I think for this week, not a must bench. If you have like receivers ahead of him or other options that you just know are going to be full-time players, get nice target shares on good offenses, I would not be opposed at all to sitting Travis Hunter week 1.
And you shouldn't have drafted him in a range where feels like a must start in week 1. I get that the talent level, a player we're excited about, you want him to become a player that you start every week, but it's not going to be bad process if you decide not to start Travis Hunter in week 1 and he ends up having a good game. That it's okay to be hesitant with a guy like that, even if you wind up being wrong. Just keep all of that in mind. Sneaky starting options, Jared. I think that the Colts wide receivers, their chances of beating their week one projections are pretty good against Miami, especially if Tyreek Hill stays where we have him projected, along with Jalen Waddle, which is both inside the top 20. I think if both of those guys pay off at that level, like prove to be strong starting options for your roster this week, I think we should get a good bit of Colts passing, which should help Josh Downs, Michael Pittman.
Yep, I like both guys. Again, I like this game. I think it has some shootout potential, assuming Tyreek Hill is healthy. I think Miami's secondary is one of the worst in the NFL. I think it's a secondary we're going to be attacking with, passing game pieces throughout the season. Josh Downs, I actually like a bit better than Michael Pittman this week. He's off the injury report. So the hamstring he dealt with in the second half of August, not a concern. And he's going to get, the Dolphins are starting a 5th round rookie in the slot, Jason Marshall Jr. That's going to be Josh Downs' primary matchup. We talked about how he's a good fit with Daniel Jones in the short passing game all summer. I think Downs has a good chance to get off to a really strong start.
Man, if we get Jalen Waddle week and Josh Downs week to start the season, I'm not even sure how I'm going to react, honestly. I'll probably have the hiccups.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a lot of those guys in DFS this week too. So fingers crossed for that stack working out.
Another guy I like is Matthew Golden for week one upside. We've got Jaden Reed looking extremely iffy. Didn't practice Wednesday on that foot injury that he's going to play through, apparently. Should be a competitive game, tied for the second highest Vegas game total of the week. So we should expect a decent number of points. Matthew Golden got plenty of buzz, got plenty of talk about how he was being used in Packers practices. And of course, everybody's talked about how this team never picks round one wide receivers and did this year. So I think, you don't want to get too excited about the rookie wide receiver who never led his college team in receptions, as we've pointed out multiple times on here. I don't think you want to get too excited about him in his NFL debut. But if you're looking down in that range, I like him as an upside play who could outscore where we have him ranked.
Yeah, me too. One of the reasons we talked about being concerned with Golden back in, throughout draft season was the Packers' propensity to rotate wide receivers. I don't know if they're going to be able to this week, right? I mean, Jaden Reed might not play. Dontavian Wicks dealing with a calf injury. Savion Williams is on the injury report. He was limited on Wednesday. So it's the only healthy wide receivers are Matthew Golden, Romeo Doubs, and Malik Heath. So you could get 85% of their outs from Golden this week. He was one of the buzziest players in the entire NFL all August. So I could definitely see him getting off to a good start. And like you said, Matt, what could be a high scoring game.
Any other sneaky wideouts for you?
I'm going to mention Deebo Samuel quick, who I like anyways. He's healthy. There was no injuries in August. The pneumonia is obviously behind him. I like his fit in this offense. And if there's a week where, he could lead the team in targets, again, it could be this week with Terry McLaurin potentially limited coming off the holdout.
And maybe he's even RB1. We'll have to see about that. I'm kidding about that, of course, but he's going to factor into the run game probably to some degree.
For sure. Yep, exactly.
Moving over to tight end now. We've got not much on the injury front here to worry about, but Cade Otton, if you're in a deep league, I guess, and you're thinking about starting the Bucs tight end, got a groin issue, limited Wednesday. I would hope that you don't have to start Cade Otton this week, but watch him if you do. The more interesting topic here, I think, is the 2 first-round rookies, Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland. Of course, Loveland went before Tyler Warren. They both went in the first half of round one. That should generally mean guys that are viewed pretty similarly in terms of early season value. But to me, Jared, Warren looks like the much better bet for week one lineups.
Yep, agreed. And for me, at least, this is based mostly on preseason usage, which, can lead us in the wrong direction sometimes, but I tend to believe it more often than not. And what we saw in the preseason, in the second preseason game when Daniel Jones got the start and played a few series, Tyler Warren played 93% of the snaps with Daniel Jones, ran her out on 91% of the pass plays. Those are elite numbers for a tight end. If those stick in the regular season, Tyler Warren's going to be a top 10 fantasy tight end. So I would, in a lot of cases, feel comfortable firing Tyler Warren up as a fantasy starter this week. Again, I think a nice matchup against Miami. Colston Loveland, on the other hand, in the second preseason game when Caleb Williams played quite a bit, just a 50% route rate with Caleb Williams. He basically split routes with Cole Kmet, and I'm expecting that to be the setup at least early in the season. Cole Kmet's a quality player. He's a veteran. I think he's going to be involved. So I do not expect Loveland to get pure starter level playing time, and Loveland is someone I would try to keep on fantasy benches at least for week one.
The long-term outlooks should look pretty similar for these 2 rookie tight ends, but for this season, just like I said, a much cleaner situation for Tyler Warren. And, we don't want to make too much of the preseason usage, but when that first round tight end gets that kind of usage with your starting quarterback, we should go ahead and believe that. I like Tyler Warren as, your team's tight end 1 heading into the season. You can adjust if we get a disappointing start from there, but I like him as a lead tight end if you drafted him. Colson Loveland, as you said, I would rather have him on the bench paired with somebody else. Maybe later in the season we get the kind of usage that we can trust in our lineups, but I would prefer to not have to trust it in my week one lineup. A sneaky option for me, Jared, is Zach Ertz, and he's really sneaky only because he was underrated at draft time. Last year, we watched Ertz deliver top 12 production on top 12 usage. We have Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel, as we said, both in low wide receiver 3 range. We have that uncertain backfield. So all of that means opportunity for, the steady veteran that Washington re-signed after the season. The matchup looks bad if you look at the fantasy points allowed from last season. The Giants were second toughest on tight ends according to our adjusted points allowed, but just 14th in tight end coverage DVOA. So I don't believe that it's actually a tough defense. I think that was a bit more of a quirky number as opposed to something we have to worry about.
Yep, agreed. And, Washington implied for 25.75 points, fourth highest on the week. So the offense in general shouldn't have any issues here. And really, I mean, this might be as good of a spot as you're going to get all season to start Zach Ertz. He's old. Maybe he fades over the second half of the season, but he should be fresh coming into week one. Terry McLaurin, again, we're expecting to be limited to some degree. Deebo Samuel, first game with a new team. Zach Ertz could, I think, should be a focal point of the passing game in this one. So I would start Zach Ertz over Colson Loveland. Another streamer type tight end I would start over Colson Loveland is Hunter Henry. Kind of another case of, a veteran where you have these receivers, Steph Diggs coming off the torn ACL. Their rookie Kyle Williams probably not going to play a big role out of the gate. So Hunter Henry should be heavily involved in this Patriots passing game, I think. And he gets a Raiders defense that was 30th against tight ends last year. So a good matchup for Henry as well.
We don't want to overplay stacking in redraft lineups, but especially if you have Drake May as your quarterback this week, starting Hunter Henry makes plenty of sense in that spot. And on behalf of old guys, I just want to say that I stayed up past midnight multiple nights this week, so we don't all fade late.
Well, it's only week one, though. You're going to be staying up till midnight in week 12. We'll see.
Probably
Yeah.
the way the season tends to go,
Yeah.
but I'll report back later. We'll move on to defenses to close this thing out. Jared, who you got for your streaming defense for week one? And I'm guessing it's the same one I do.
I got a few. I mean, I think Arizona is my favorite. 6.5 point favorites against Spencer Rattler. If the Cardinals get out to a lead, which I think they will, and Spencer Rattler has to drop back 40 times, I think the Cardinals are in a good spot. And the Cardinals defense could be quite a bit better this year. I think it's, at least going to be a league average defense, maybe even better than.
Yeah, there's potential for it to be pretty good. The biggest mark in their favor is facing Spencer Rattler this week. Took sacks at an 8.8% rate last year, threw 5 interceptions versus just 4 touchdown passes. And, even on the downside risk side, he only averaged 5.8 yards per pass attempt. Granted, they had the wide receiver injuries. He was a rookie. He should be better this year, but this is just a matchup that's high ceiling, low risk for the Cardinals if you're looking for a streaming level D. Who else do you have for week one options?
Yeah, I think Washington is in play. Not a good defense, but they're 6-point home favorites against the Giants. Russell Wilson has a career 8.5 sack rate. Even when Russell Wilson was good, he took sacks at a high rate. So I think there's nice sack upside on Washington this week. And I also like the Rams. They're at home. That's a good pass rush that I think is getting better. They have some young pass rushers there. And against a bad Texans O-line, maybe the worst offensive line in the NFL. The Texans, too, are implied for just 20.25 points. That's the 6th lowest on the week. So I think the Rams are a good week one streamer as well.
If you're looking for a defense for week one or even week two, check the free agent finder for a team like the Rams. You can find out whether they're available in the specific league you're looking for, or if there's just one that you want to look for overall, you can check the cross league option to quickly see if that defense or if any guy at another position is available in any of the leagues you have synced. And Jared, I like that you brought up the Rams because if you do play them this week, you can also hold on to them for week two usage. And they're available in lots of places, just 24% rostered across Yahoo leagues heading into week one. So you could get the Rams to play them this week and also at Tennessee in week two. You won't want to play them at Philly in week three, but even week four at home against the Colts could prove to be a matchup in which we want to use that defense.
Yep, I like that, man. What a brutal start for Cam Ward having to face Denver and then the Rams. So I think are going to have a surprisingly strong pass rush this season. Arizona, I'll mention, they get Carolina in week two. Not as good of a matchup as in week one, but in deeper leagues where there's not a ton of defenses available, I do think if you play Arizona this week, you can keep them for next week. The Niners get the Saints in week two. The Saints were going to be attacking for a lot of the season. So the Niners, I think, are a good week two streamer. And then I also wanted to mention the Bills and the Ravens play each other in week one. They shouldn't be in starting lineups this week as a starting DST. maybe they're dropped, maybe they're just available in your league. But in week 2, the Bills get the Jets and the Ravens get the Browns. They're both going to be strong week 2 fantasy options. So if you have space on your bench to, stash a defense, you're not going to use them this week, but for week 2, they're both going to be strong options.
And if you drafted the Bills and you're like, oh crap, I don't want to start them against the Ravens, don't drop them, because after that Jets matchup in week 2, the next 3 games after that are at home against the Dolphins, home against the Saints, and home against the Patriots. So you're starting the Bills for 4 straight weeks after this week. If they are available, go ahead and grab them. I agree.
How do the Bills get that schedule?
Yeah.
Man.
I don't even know. Well, actually, so 2 of those teams are in their division,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
3 of those teams are in their division. So
Nice.
that's how they got us.
Nice to play in the AFC East, I guess.
Check the week 1 rankings for any format, including your specific league settings for any team that you have synced at draftsharks.com. Check out Jody Smith's new start sit column on Draft Sharks. Yet another strong recent addition to the Draft Sharks staff. Jody, if you don't know him, has been in the industry for years, proving his own rankings accuracy even before joining us, just like we have. So we're just getting more accurate around here by the day. Your team intel page will also give you full lineup recommendations for any synced roster. And the Who to Start tool is live, ready to help you with any agonizing final close decisions. As always, Draft Sharks is here to be your unfair advantage.